Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to 2022. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA. This is our January 6th, 2022 legislative update. Before we begin, let me remind you, if you have any questions about anything I talk about today or anything I don't talk about today, put them in the chat box and we'll rotate back to them at the end of the presentation. And with that, we'll jump right in. Kind of one sad and one exciting first for January 6th historically. Today was the day that Thomas Edison filed his very last patent application. He ended up with a little over 1,000 patents, as you all know, including some of the seminal work in electrotechnology. Among many other things, he is also a founder of IEEE and really the grandfather of the modern world. On this date, perhaps somewhat less significant, but all the same. In 1973, Schoolhouse Rock debuted on ABC during cartoons on Saturday morning. Their little I'm Only a Bill piece remains one of the better, really short summaries of how bills become law that I've ever seen. And I certainly remember it from when I was a kid. I wanted to quickly wrap up 2021. Now, most of this stuff I covered back in December, but I gotten a lot of questions from members in the last few weeks, so I just wanted to go over it again. The NDAA did, in fact, pass back in December, as we expected it to. It was a fairly clean bill in the end. I mean, it was a big bill. There was a lot in there. But almost everything in there was related to defense policy. Congress didn't take this opportunity to dump everything into that bill. So there's a number of things that we care about on cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and research, all of which is quite good. But overall, it was a fairly straightforward bill, relatively speaking. The 2022 appropriations deadline has been extended to February, more on that in just a second. And the debt ceiling has been put off until the end of this year, early next year. Congressional leaders didn't want to have that debate again before the election, so they moved the debt ceiling far enough in the future so that they should be able to ignore it until, maybe this coming December, but more likely a little bit into 2023. Looking at the 2022 appropriations process. Now, just to clarify, these are the bills that will fund the government for the 2022 fiscal year, which began back last October. The deadline that Congress has given itself is now February 18th. That is, of course, not a real deadline. Congress can move it if they want. But we're getting to the point where that starts to become kind of silly. The fiscal 2023 appropriations process should start right around in early February. And Congress doesn't want to have to be dealing with two sets of appropriation bills at the same time, so we're getting to the point where Congress is going to have to pass something on appropriations before too long. The problem is there's still considerable distance between the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, on the appropriations bills. The defense appropriations bill in particular is proving to be contentious, which is significant because usually that's one of the easier ones. The House of Representatives has put in for a very, very small increase in DoD appropriations. The Senate wants a bigger one. There's a lot of disagreement over the research budgets in the appropriations bills, which we'll get to in a little bit. But if Congress can't come to an agreement on what is traditionally one of the easy ones, it doesn't bode well for the harder bills. The House has passed most, but not all, of the appropriations bills, and the Senate has failed to pass any, which again shows you just how far away they are from getting anything reconciling their two positions. Here's the problem. Right now, in the House bills and the draft Senate bills, there are significant increases in most of the budgets that we care about. Most of the research budgets, DOE, the energy budgets, the NASA, NIST, the things that IEEE members care about, most of them are doing quite well. The problem is, the closer we get to February 18th, if Congress is unable to reach an agreement on what the appropriations bills are supposed to look like, there will be pressure on Congress to simply give up. And they do that by just passing a continuing resolution for the entire fiscal year and say, everybody just keep spending what you're spending until October, which they have done in the past, not very often, but occasionally. The problem with that is if they go that route, most of the nice budget increases we were looking forward to will go away simply because they won't pass appropriations bills. And so IEEE-USA is working to encourage Congress to actually appropriate. And, they can put it into one big omnibus bill. That's probably the only avenue they have left at this point. But in an omnibus bill, we could get still pretty good budget increases, which we have our fingers crossed for. Congress has a lot of other smaller things to get done this year. There are 4 science engineering related bills in particular that Congress is going to have to do something about. Well, 3 of them they have to do something about this year. The National Science Foundation, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and NASA all need to be reauthorized. As we've talked about in the past, Congress does this with most government agencies. When they are created, they put into the law creating them that the programs go away unless Congress renews them or reauthorizes them, which forces Congress to look at these programs periodically to make sure they're still working. Now, there's obviously not a lot of chance that NIST, NSF, or NASA will go away, excuse me, but it is a process they have to go through to reauthorize them. In addition, this year we have the USICA, which used to be the Endless Frontiers Act, which is a substantial investment in technology research coming out of the Senate. House is not nearly as excited. So we have these 3 bills. The House, particularly the House Science Committee, has indicated that it wants to deal with each one of them individually. This is typical of the House Science Committee, which likes to do a lot of smaller bills, traditionally speaking. The Senate, on the other hand, has indicated they want to package all of these things into 1 or maybe 2 bigger bills just to save time, which is also typical of the Senate. The problem is the House is not, particularly the House Science Committee, the Democrats in the House Science Committee in particular, are not excited about the USICA. They're looking for a much broader research bill. They don't want to pick favorites. They don't want to target research on technology specifically. The Senate, Senator Schumer, Senate Majority Leader, is championing this, is of course much more excited. So the idea is Congress is going to take these 3 bills and package them somehow, whether it's 1 bill, 2 bills, maybe 3 bills. It's going to put them together into some legislative vehicles later in the year. Now, Election Day this year is November 8th. What that means is once we get to Labor Day, first of all, that is the constitutionally latest day it can possibly be. November 1st is a Tuesday, and we can't have Election Day on Tuesday, on the first Tuesday of November, if that day is November 1st. So the election falls to November 8th, which does give Congress a little bit more time up front, which they probably won't use. It means they have about a week less after Election Day to get things done. These bills, the NSF, NIST, NASA reauthorization bills, are exactly the kind of bills that typically or frequently fall till after the election, and they become a December play in an election year. We're hoping that's not the case here because that Congress has a difficult time focusing after elections, particularly if there are major shifts in political power in Washington as the result of the election. But at the moment, these bills aren't really on the agenda, and we don't really have a path forward for them yet, which does suggest it's going to take a little while to get them done. IEEE-USA is up on Capitol Hill working these issues, trying to not only get them passed, but make sure they're passed in ways that suit the interests of IEEE members, particularly the USICA, which we remain very excited about. Little note on the Defense Department budget, the FY 2023 and the 2022 budgets. First of all, the Department of Defense has a statutory deadline of February 7th to put out its FY 2023 defense budget. It's not going to. It's not going to for a number of reasons. First of all, the Afghan drawdown has forced or allowed, depending on one's perspective, the Defense Department to radically readjust its priorities, which takes time. More importantly, because the 2022 budget hasn't been finalized yet, the Defense Department doesn't know where its baseline is. It usually takes the previous year's budgets and then starts to adjust them, but it doesn't have a budget for this year yet, and so that's harder to do. And so the expectation is that the 2023 defense budget will be pushed off until later in the spring. This is significant because the DoD research budgets are one of the very few parts of the FY 2022 budget that are not good. As you can see down there, overall defense R&D was actually cut by the House and in the President's budget request. The House reduced it by about 5%. The Senate increased it by 5%, illustrating the gap between the two budgets. However, this is one of the things that IEEE-USA is focusing on in the 2022 budget. And if we can't get the research budgets where they need to be, we will, of course, start working on the 2023 budget immediately. And we'll have a little bit more time to do that since the 2023 budget has been pushed off. Non-budget matters. You'll recall that last year, one of the big legislative successes was the passage of the infrastructure bill. Congress finally got, after about 6 years of effort, got a major infrastructure bill passed. A small part of that are what Washington is calling broadband nutritional labels. And the idea here is that broadband providers need to create a little labeling thing that will allow consumers to very quickly and easily tell things like price, data allowances, download, upload speeds, and some basic numbers pertaining to their broadband service, which are sometimes hard to determine and hard to compare across brands. The FCC is starting to move on that. They've announced that they will put forward regulations on these labels shortly. And IEEE-USA is looking forward to them. We thought this was a good idea and advocated for it for many years before it finally made it into law. And it's nice to see the FCC moving so quickly on a piece of the infrastructure bill. Little note on the kind of legal side of technology. The European Union has announced that it is looking to apply fines to both Facebook and Google for their cookie technology. Specifically, the two companies allegedly made it too hard for users of their technology in France to opt out of cookies. It's, of course, much more complicated than that, but this lawsuit again highlights how debate over digital privacy and internet regulation has really left the United States. Because the U.S. Congress hasn't bothered to act in this space, Europe is starting to establish global standards, simply because they have laws on the books and they're using them. California obviously has some laws, a few other states has laws, but without a national law, the U.S. government, American people more generally, are missing out on an opportunity to influence these debates and kind of set the standards of behavior for companies online. Something to put on your calendar. IEEE-USA's Congressional Visits Day will be April 5th and 6th this year. We normally hold that in the spring, so that's a kind of a typical time for us to hold it. The event will be virtual again this year. We simply, right now, legislators aren't doing meetings on Capitol Hill, and I'm skeptical that they will be by April. But they certainly won't be before people have to start booking flights to Washington. So we'll have to do the event virtually again this year. However, we did Congressional Visits Day virtually in 2021, and it was phenomenally successful. I want to offer an invitation to any and all IEEE members in the United States to join us for this event, this annual event. It's a lot of fun. And we got some great FaceTime with members of Congress last year. I suspect we will do so again this year. Registration will open shortly, and I hope you all will be able to join us. Note another engineering triumph just this week. The Jim Webb Telescope, the next generation of orbital telescopes, was successfully launched earlier this week and has begun the process of deploying itself. Cool picture there on the right on your screen that show the telescope all kind of boxed up. Apparently, because the telescope is so big, the process of deploying it now that it is in orbit will take at least 5 months. It's also worth noting that according to NASA, there are over 300 possible points of failure in this deployment process. So the first part of the process was completed 2 days ago as the sun screen was deployed. The sun shield, I guess is what they're calling it. And as we watch as this technological marvel is unraveled out in space all by itself, we again extend our congratulations to the IEEE members and other engineers and technical folks at NASA for pulling this off, and our fingers crossed that it goes smoothly. Our next update will be Thursday, January 20th. 2 weeks as usual. We're back onto a regular schedule, at least for the first part of 2022. And again, if you have any questions about anything that I've mentioned or anything you're just curious about, go ahead and put them in your chat box. I'll rotate to that in just a moment. While you're doing that, I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Excuse me. And pull this up. Will Robinson, past Vice President of Government Relations for IEEE-USA, you are correct. Statutorily speaking, the President is obligated to submit a budget to Congress in early February. And they almost never do. I mean, they do. What will happen is he'll submit a fairly basic budget to Congress, and then we'll get the actual budget numbers out probably in March or April, right around the time of the CVD, as a matter of fact. Because the 2022 budget is so far behind schedule, it will make the rest of the government, we already talked about the Defense Department, everybody else in the government is going to have the same problem. How much do you want to ask for in 2023 if you don't know how much you're going to get in 2022? And so I suspect the president's budget, like I said, will be early spring-ish, which is fine. I mean, that's still plenty of time for Congress to get the budget done. It's hard to know what the president's priorities are going to be. His priorities in the 2022 budget were, in fact, to invest heavily in research and heavily in technology. If Congress does that, I suspect we'll have a harder time getting significant additional increases in the 2023 budget, and will instead be focusing on maintaining the budget levels that we have with an increase for inflation, which, of course, will be the big challenge. If Congress doesn't manage to get the increases in the actual budget whenever they finalize it, then we will push to do next year what they weren't able to do last year, if that makes sense. But until we know what the 2022 budget is, it's hard to know which of those two things we're going to be able to focus on. Brendan Godfrey's question was very technical. Brendan, as many of you know, Vice President of Career and Member Services on the IEEE-USA Board and former Vice President of Government Relations with IEEE-USA. He is also a former Defense Department researcher, very senior Defense Department researcher, and thus knows a great deal more about the DoD's R&D budget than I do. Brendan, I think that's something we can look at. It's a bit nuanced for Congress, and it is asking, if Congress can't get the basic budget passed, it's going to be tough to ask them to do kind of budget tweaks like that. But that's certainly something we can raise with Congress and see if they bite. I suspect it will be easier to do this year than next year. So this might be the right time to bring it up. Oh, which reminds me, Brendan Godfrey reminded me pointed out very politely and diplomatically, pointed out a mistake I made on our last update when I told you the Texas legislature was in session in 2022. That is apparently not the case. They were in session last year and will be back in 2023. The way the Texas legislature does things, in a peculiarly Texan way, the legislature is only in every other year. And in the off years, In the off years, the committees, the legislative committees meet to do the legislative work of crafting legislation, which is actually a pretty good way of doing it. I mean, these bills do take a long time to put together, and spending some time to do it right is a useful thing. Brendan, you and I should discuss that. I'm not entirely interpreting what you're asking correctly then. So you can give me a call this afternoon. We can talk it over. And Don, Brendan is looking at the Defense Department's R&D spending programs. That's research within the Defense Department. And I think that is our questions for today. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Hope you all have a great start to your 2022. And I look forward to speaking with you all again in a couple weeks on the 20th. Thanks for joining us and have a great afternoon. Take care.
My superpower is engineering. I've been a roboticist almost all my life now. I think engineering is just as creative as the arts. Engineers, we solve problems. It impacts the world. It makes a difference. Without IEEE, I don't think I would have the network that I have. Anyone can get involved with IEEE-USA at any time. There's an immense amount of value for anyone at any career stage.